It's here. The episode that you've been waiting for is finally here. It has arrived. Today, we are going to have Matt Lawson on to talk about points leagues. I know. I spend most of my time talking about category leagues. And this is obviously a Dynasty podcast. So we talk about Dynasty category leagues, which is a pretty niche group of leagues. There's a lot of people that play in these leagues. And so that's why that's why there's a need for the show. But obviously, there's a whole market of people that play points leagues that there isn't as much content for. So, sorry, it's not my area of expertise, but that's why I'm having Matt on to talk about it. I'm not just tackling it all alone. But then we're also going to do something else fun here today for maybe the first time on this show. And we're not just going to talk about Dynasty League. So we have Matt's Dynasty points rankings. And we also have his first pass at redraft points rankings for this upcoming season. So if you really want to get ahead of the game, you can check out this episode, even if you don't play in a Dynasty League. Now, I do still hold the opinion that whether you're playing in a redraft league or a Dynasty League, and like whatever one maybe you play in both, but if you only play in one of those, having an idea of what both landscapes look like is really important. Maybe if you just play in a Dynasty League and you need to know who's going to be really good this year, like who's ready to take that leap forward, checking out some redraft rankings is huge. And if you're just a redraft league player and maybe you didn't pay attention too much during the summer because you just do the redraft league and then you take your 6 months off and then you try and get caught back up, the Dynasty rankings are a great thing to keep up with and be like, interesting. This player that I, checked out one time last year was ranked 250th last year. Now they're 150th. Okay, so maybe they're actually going to be pretty good this year. Or maybe they're a player that I should take my last pick and just take a dart throw. Maybe that player will be having a breakout year. So I think it's really relevant for both sets of leagues to have an idea of what the other looks like. And then obviously there's a lot of us that play in both, so it's really relevant. But due to the fact that I am not the points league expert, we have Matt on, and we're going to talk about both redraft and Dynasty leagues in one episode. So I'll be bringing Matt on here in just a moment, and we're going to be talking about his rankings. Alrighty, and we now have Matt on the show today. As I said, we are going to be talking about points leagues, which is something that we have not done enough of. So that's why we're going to make sure we do it and spend a whole episode just talking about points leagues. Before we get into Matt's Dynasty points rankings and his first redraft points rankings, Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm great. We lamented on our last show that there really isn't a lot of basketball right now. We're getting like drips and drabs of it, but it is a nice pause to be able to kind of like assess what's going on for this upcoming season. What I'm excited about is we're starting to get kind of the initial projections. I know Basketball Monster, I think, is going to be rolling out this week, which is always exciting for me. I love the work that Josh does over at Basketball Monster. I think his projections are, as someone who's done this now for well over a decade, he is like the best at being able to not only have really smart projections, but also they're not safe either. I think he takes chances on things. He has an opinion about things. So cannot recommend those highly enough. I think a Basketball Monster subscription is well worth it. I have no affiliation with it. I'm just a member myself. But that's great. I know Joey over at Hashtag Basketball just released his. Adam Stock just said that he had gotten done with kind of his first run. So like some of the people that, in the space who do that work that I think ends up shaping a lot of opinions have started to come in with it. And I think that's really helpful to get in on that as early as possible and help that to be able to kind of shape your opinions, create that thought process for you about who you value this year, who the sleepers are before everyone else catches up. Because what's going to happen is the market is really soft right now, especially in the trade market, not just for redraft because people aren't really drafting yet, but for Dynasty, like if you're a win now team, or even if you're just trying to get ahead on who the breakout players, the young players that might break out are going to be this season, if you get in on the ground floor right now of figuring that out, which is, something that you're doing by watching this, but also if you do it by taking a look at what projections look like for this year, I think it's really, really helpful. You're going to be way ahead because by the time we get into, mid-September, end of September into early October, everyone's going to kind of have the same opinions. Consensus is going to be forming around who's going to break out, and it's going to be a lot harder to be able to make those big value trades. But if you get going with it now, I think you're going to be able to get those kinds of deals that really change your franchise in your dynasty league.
Definitely. There's definitely a lot of opportunities now to make a ton of fun deals. I've had a few go down in my league, which I talked about on the show yesterday, where I drafted a league and then within a day or two of the draft finishing, Luka, Jokic, Jalen Johnson, Jalen Williams, Dyson Daniels, all these guys were traded. It was a ton of fun. But it's just this time of year. It doesn't have to be right after a draft finishes. It's just when you can make the deals. And you mentioned there isn't much basketball going on. We have Eurobasket in about 2 weeks. It'll start up. So that'll give us something to actually watch. So that'll be pretty cool there. And then there is just so much content being put out right now that's good initial content that's starting to kind of shape things that for a little while there wasn't really anything. I mean, Adam King's been doing redraft mocks for, a few of them over the past month or so. And it's like, who does do a redraft mock in July? But it does kind of start to shape how things will look 3 months later because it's kind of a baseline for a lot of different things. And you mentioned a number of different guys that do incredible work. But with your process for starting with some of these early projections, without giving too many of your tips and tricks away, what kind of goes into that for you?
Yeah, for me, I kind of start from scratch with every player. And what I'm looking at, usually the easiest way to be able to do it is kind of get per minute stats for every player and then gauge where you think they're going to be trending in different categories. And then that's, whether you're doing categories rankings or points rankings, kind of the basis of them should be statistical projections for different stats. And I find that ends up being pretty valuable. The baseline, of course, for me was, and I started this, months ago, of doing minute projections. Minutes are the lifeblood of fantasy basketball. If you're not getting minutes, you can't produce fantasy stats. So figuring out who's going to play and how much is number one. Beyond that, it's then figuring out how good at producing these statistics that matter in your format are these players. Are they trending up, trending down? Is their role going to be changing in a way that's going to make them more likely to get assists, more likely to get blocks? What is their efficiency going to be trending in the right direction because of changes in their context or their development as a player? And then kind of having takes around that for each player. And I also like to revisit what I projected the previous year, kind of see how that looked compared to what actually happened. And that helps me refine my process too, to be like, okay, I can see that I'm a little overzealous on projecting development in young players. I maybe need to rethink that and tone that down, or I projected too much of a decline for some of these older guys. It might be a little bit more gradual than I anticipated. So maybe I don't ramp down their per minute production quite as much just because they're turning 36, 37. These are the things that you need to be thinking about when you're doing it. And you might not have time to be able to create your own statistical projections. That's fine. You can use some of these sets that are out there. You could modify them. You could modify the minutes to be able to do it yourself. And that's like really the next level. And it gives you an ability to be able to have your own opinions about things. Once you really dig deep into it, you begin to be able to shape how you actually feel about players, where you see the values instead of just waiting for people to kind of spoon feed that to you.
And that's what gives you the edge as a dynasty or redraft manager, is you're not just seeing what other people are saying. Like you said, you're starting to get your own advantage, that you're creating your own rankings. It could be based off someone else, but you're creating your own rankings and projections, and then nobody else in your league can copy that. It's your own personal set. And then if you are right about players, because you're betting on yourself and you're betting on your own knowledge, then you get an advantage that nobody else has. So if I'm pulling up here your dynasty points rankings, just so we can take a look at them, the top really isn't, this is the wrong one. This is the dynasty points rankings. The top really isn't that different, with the first 5 players being Wemby, Jokic, SGA, Luka, Cade Cunningham. Same thing as category leagues. It's Wemby at 1. It's a combination of Jokic, SGA, Luka, and then it's Cade Cunningham in most rankings. But right after that, if we go down, it's Giannis at 6. And if we check out our partners at FanDuel, they currently have Giannis number 4 in the preseason MVP rankings, which shouldn't be surprising whatsoever. You can see here it's just SGA, Jokic, and Luka above him, which makes sense entirely. All of the top guys in the dynasty points ranking end up being towards the top of the preseason MVP rankings. Giannis is fourth. He should be in for a really, really big season with, not much help on that team. If the Bucks are going to have any success whatsoever, it's going to be because Giannis has a monster season, which is why he's fourth in the preseason betting odds. Make sure to check that out at sportsbook.fanduel.com. But getting back to the Dynasty rankings, what is the difference here? I mean, obviously it is the free throw percentage, and that's the main difference here for Giannis. And I guess you're just looking at how many points he scores, not if he hits threes or not. But is that why he's so high in your Dynasty points rankings compared to him being a handful of spots lower in your category rankings?
Yeah, so kind of regardless of what your points format looks like, and I'm going to talk in a moment about kind of the variations there, Giannis is going to be more valuable in a points format than a categories format for a couple of reasons. And they relate to both his lack of 3-point shooting, which doesn't really harm you in a points format, and the free throw percentage, which you just mentioned, because most points formats are not going to deduct anything for missing free throws. If anything, the fact that he gets to the line a ton, even if he's only hitting 60% of them in a season, it is still a positive to you because it's extra points that are going to be accumulated when he gets to the line and he's only hitting 60%. And I think that this season, because there's no Damian Lillard, because everything is being built around Giannis for this season, and he is still in the midst of his prime at 30 years old, we could be seeing a season that could be the number one points format player. He could compete with Jokic, even a breakout Victor Wembanyama year. Like, he could be at the top when it comes down to it, because you're looking at a player, and this is the kind of stat set that is really valuable in a points format, regardless of your scoring. Huge points, rebounds, assists, and also getting you some steals and blocks as well, that can contribute a little bit on the margins. Those are the kind of the bedrock, the core of a really strong fantasy stat set. If you've got a guy who can potentially be getting triple doubles, that's going to be immensely valuable in a points format. Giannis brings that kind of stat set to the table. So and it's rare to be able to find guys who can be both elite rebounders, elite scorers, and also rack up a lot of assists. That's why someone like Jokic, why Luka Doncic are so high up in these rankings, because that's exactly the kind of stat set that they bring to the table. And their efficiency, some of them are better than others, and that's why they might rank higher in categories formats, because that efficiency from the field and the free throw line matters there. Their ability to be able to shoot threes in high volume, make threes in high volume, matters more in a categories format, where that's one of 9 categories. But in a points format, it's that raw accumulation, that box score production, points, rebounds, and assists. That's really what carries the day.
Yeah, and just to hit you with a fun hypothetical here, because I like to do that, the trade talk surrounding Giannis has really cooled off at this point. There are occasionally, every couple of weeks, we'll get some sort of report that says, well, things could still change and Giannis could still ask for a trade, or things could heat up. And it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. But in the scenario where Giannis were traded, probably to a team where it's going to have to gut basically most of their other good players on the team to get Giannis there, he's still going to be Giannis pretty much wherever he goes. Like, no team is going to trade for him to be a number 2 option. They're going to trade for him to give his production on their team. Does that change your evaluation from a dynasty perspective or from a redraft perspective?
From redraft, no, because I think it's so unlikely that it happens in season. I mean, it could, but it's unlikely to. I think this is the kind of trade that's going to happen in the offseason, because that is going to open up more possibilities for who is able to make that deal, who wants to make that deal, and the price is probably going to be better in return for the Bucks. So I don't see, unless Giannis forced it, for them to make that move at the trade deadline this season. And even if it did, like you said, anybody who's bringing in Giannis would need to be trading out significant heavy salary coming back to be able to make that work, which would likely, and for the most part in the league, we've seen most of the dead weight salary get bought out, or it's just kind of faded away. Teams are being a lot more careful. So if you're trading back heavy salary, it's probably a good player who gets a lot of usage, who now that usage is going to be taken over by Giannis in return. There's only a few teams where their high usage player is still on a rookie scale contract, so that you could bring Giannis in and have that player kind of be a 1A, 1B with Giannis. And the San Antonio Spurs would be one of the few examples. And I guess that deal would probably involve De'Aaron Fox coming out and in the trade, which would make it more likely that Giannis would still be able to be a monster usage player next to Wembanyama, even in a situation where he's with another big time scorer. So no, it doesn't factor in for redraft. For Dynasty, I don't like to price in future trades as much with Dynasty unless it feels like an absolute foregone conclusion that it's going to happen. And I do think eventually Giannis will probably get traded out of Milwaukee. But at the same point, I think he's going to continue out his prime as exactly what he is, a perennial MVP candidate, an all NBA guy, someone who plays the style of play that he does and was going to continue to on whatever team that he plays on. He's that level of talent where it doesn't really matter the context around him. It's going to be built around him. Like James Harden once said, he is the system. He's not a system player.
Yeah, that's 100% true, especially for Giannis. Moving down, so Giannis is 6th. Then we have Cooper Flag 7, Alperen Şengün 8, Anthony Edwards 9, Chet Holmgren 10, and then Paolo Banchero 11. I think Şengün and Banchero are two players that are at least a handful of spots higher in points leagues than in category leagues. And what sticks out for them is it the same kind of thing for Giannis, where it's like Banchero isn't getting too many defensive stats. His field goal percentage and free throw percentage aren't great, but now we don't care about that quite as much because he's giving you a ton of points, rebounds, and assists. And kind of the same thing there for Şengün.
Yeah, but Banchero has that stat set. It's actually kind of not that dissimilar from someone like Julius Randle when he was a younger player, where there's a lot of deficiency in the defensive stats. The efficiency from the line is a problem. From the field is even not that great because he takes too many mid-rangers. But like none of that really impacts you in a points format. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but like when you're talking about most common points formats, I think there's like 3 variations. The first one is kind of your standard. I think the NBA has blessed it as kind of the official one, and it's similar to what you get on some of the DFS platforms where points are worth 1 point. You get 1.2 points per rebound, 1.5 points per assist, 3 points for steals, 3 points for blocks, -1 for turnovers. That's kind of your standard points format. What has become a little bit more popular lately is sleepers default. Kind of when you start a sleeper league, a lot of people don't change it. That has only a half point per point, 1 point for rebound, 1 point for assists. So rebounds and assists are worth double of what a point is. And then you get 2 points for steals, 2 points for blocks, -1 for turnovers, and some bonuses for triple doubles, double doubles. So you can automatically see if you're in that kind of format, if you're in a sleeper format that has that default setting, suddenly those rebounds and assists are going to become massively valuable. And guys who get both are going to be huge. Paolo Banchero is a great example of that. Alperen Şengün, another great example of that, of guys who maybe their efficiency from the free throw line and even sometimes the field is not the most effective. They don't get you a ton of 3-pointers, but what they do is get you a lot of rebounds, more assists than you would think for players of their size. And that can lead to really big productive stat lines. The third, and to close the loop on this, the third stat format for points leagues that's pretty common is I think more popular in ESPN leagues, where there's a deduction for efficiency or inefficiency, as it would be, that if for field goals missed, that you're going to get a reduction. That's going to create it to be a little bit more like a categories league, where efficiency matters, where you get deductions if players miss shots. So you want to be able to find efficient players as well. And that I find end up boosting even more players who are big men who are super efficient from the field because they're taking all their shots near the rim, a lot of dunks. And so they're not really missing anything, but they're also racking up all those rebound stats that create a really nice foundation for them every single game because they're getting 8, 9, 10 plus rebounds a game on top of it. So Paolo and Şengün are great examples of that. Anybody who plays in a points league knows those guys have come into the league and been immediate, big time, top 15, top 20 contributors in their early seasons. And I think the sky is the limit going forward for them to be top 10 producers in points leagues in future seasons, and maybe as early as this season. I think both are going to have really strong years.
So you mentioned there's basically 3 standard points leagues formats. There's what's pretty much what you're doing on Yahoo and Fantrax. There's what you're doing on Sleeper, and there's what you're doing on ESPN. do you factor in all three of those when you're creating your points rankings? Is it kind of like just like an average between the three, or do you maybe see where players rank on each of the three and then take that average ranking? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, I usually like to look at all of them to be able to see if there's outlier to it, if it's kind of similar for players. And then that helps me to be able to understand, okay, which stat sets kind of carry the day in all of these. And those are going to be players that I'm going to just have a little bit higher in my rankings to be able to say, kind of regardless of your format, because as I talk with people and give them advice on points leagues and ask them what their format looks like, there's always like slight variations. That makes it very difficult to be able to provide standard advice. And I think that's maybe why it's a little bit more difficult to find advice for points formats. Comparing it to fantasy football, the popularization of like point per reception leagues, super flex leagues, kind of for the first time in fantasy football created this schism where you didn't just have one standard format. And there's enough content out there. You can kind of find anything that you're looking for. And some, of the big platforms have found a way to be able to provide advice for some of those variations. But basketball is a lot different in the sense that you have completely different scoring formats between head-to-head categories, roto categories, points format, head-to-head points formats with all different kinds of scoring systems. And I can understand why people can sometimes get frustrated, and it makes all of this a little bit less accessible. But what I want people to come away from this podcast to be able to understand is that if you are in a points format, I think regardless of what your format looks like, there are certain things that you can look out for in stat sets and ways to be able to understand players, to be able to see who will be valuable, and certain strategic points that we're going to touch on as we're going through all of this that will make you a much better points format player, make it easier for you yourself to be able to create your own rankings, or at least have them in your head rather than having to depend on that content being fed to you. Our goal here is to be able to kind of teach you how to fish rather than giving you the fish. And I think that that's something that you can do by trying to understand the core strategy of a points format, the core elements of what stat sets matter. And that's what I want to be able to impress on everybody as we're doing this and as we're talking about them going forward, because I'm finding like every time I poll my audience, and just from the number of questions that I get about it, increasingly, I think it's getting closer to 50-50 for dynasty leagues on how many people are playing on sleeper, especially versus how many people are playing in categories formats on other platforms. I get screenshots all the time of people asking questions about their sleeper league, and I immediately know, okay, so there's a points format. Here's how to help you. And I think if you're just getting kind of standard categories advice for those leagues, you're going to be led astray pretty quickly. Or if you're just kind of depending on a fantasy football mindset in your dynasty basketball league, because that seems to be the most common way that people get into this. They had a fantasy football league with their buddies, or they liked playing sleeper dynasty and for the NFL, and they decided, hey, I'm going to give NBA a shot. And they come in with that mindset, maybe not knowing the player pool as well, not understanding the differences between the NFL and the NBA as far as the length of players' careers, how valuable first-round picks are going to be in your format. And you can make some pretty big mistakes pretty quickly. And I remember making that transition. I started playing in fantasy basketball dynasty leagues after being in football leagues for, almost a decade. I started doing NBA leagues in the early 2010s, and it was a completely different environment. It took me a while to be able to get my footing with it. I didn't find that there was a lot of content to be able to get there. And that's why I think things like this podcast are so helpful, to be able to help people understand the differences.
Yeah, I know we've talked about it a few times, just like the difference between fantasy football, fantasy basketball. Because when I'm thinking back, now that you brought it up, to like my first dynasty basketball league that I played in, it was just with friends, and I always look back and I really regret this trade because I had a fantasy football dynasty mindset of, oh, my first round pick, if my team is not really good or I want to rebuild, that player is probably worth like 3 firsts. Cool. So looking back, this is a trade I have from 2020. I traded Jokic and young up and coming player DeJounte Murray at the time for 3 first-round picks, a second-round pick, and DeAndre Hunter. And I look back, I'm like, oh my goodness, what? Like, first of all, Jokic for 3 firsts, and now he's still the number one player basically in fantasy basketball, but also just tossing in DeJounte Murray just to make the trade work, and then how he panned out a couple years later. Yeah, those types of trades are a little different in fantasy basketball versus fantasy football. So that's my least favorite trade I think I've ever made in any fantasy league ever. So keep going down with some of these rankings. After Banchero at 11, we have Jalen Johnson at 12, Evan Mobley at 13, Jason Tatum at 14, LaMelo Ball at 15, Karl Anthony Towns at 16, Aman Thompson 17, Tyrese Halliburton 18. And just one of the things I'm noticing now is that Aman Thompson is a little bit lower in your points leagues rankings versus your categories leagues rankings. I guess this is kind of like the inverse of a guy like a Paolo Banchero, or some of the other guys we've talked about that are better in points leagues, where Aman Thompson isn't doing as much damage with his points, but it's a lot of the other categories, specifically the defensive stats, that really give him value in categories leagues. Is that why he's a little bit lower in points leagues? And I guess, do you think that he still has the talent to eventually just be a better scorer and maybe be better in points leagues?
Yeah, I think, we'll see this when we get to my redraft rankings for this year. I think Amen Thompson's going to move up a little bit for me because this is a little bit of a relic, and I've slowly been moving him up. There was a point where it seemed like his rebound and assist rates were not going to be quite what we wanted, or at least not in the trajectory we wanted. I think that corrected itself as last season went on, but earlier in the season, there was a point where it seemed like, oh, this guy might just be kind of more of a steals and blocks defensive stat, beast in categories leagues, and maybe there's isn't going to be that points, rebounds, assists factor as much in his stat set. And I think we saw, especially when Fred VanVleet was out, that the future for Amen Thompson, I think, is at least in rebounds and assists. But, as he gets more minutes, I think there's going to be some growth there for him. And I'm inclined to probably move him up in my next ranking set a little bit, where his categories and points are going to align. But a lot of the value for him is that he's going to be monstrous in steals and blocks. And for categories leagues, that matters a lot. I also think it matters in sleeper leagues. And this is an important thing that we talked a little bit about on our Q&A last week, that sleeper leagues, most of them, unless they're legacy, to do the game pick where you picked in ahead of the game that the player is playing, to be able to select one per week that they're going to pick. The most of them now, and I think almost all, if they've gotten rid of it entirely, are lock-in mode, where you get to be able to see the result of a player's game, and you get to say, this is the score that I want for this player in this starting slot this week. And the advantage of that with players like Amen Thompson are, if he has a game with a ton of steals, a ton of blocks, and kind of his usual output in other categories, that's the one to be able to lock in. And those can be kind of aberration games, because steals and blocks can come in bunches in games. If the other team's really sloppy with the ball, if there's just a particular matchup where they're able to pick the pocket of a guy because he's got a loose handle over and over again, and suddenly you have a game where they have 4 or 5 steals. Well, if steals count for 2 or 3 points in your league, and you get otherwise like strong production in other categories, that's a massive spike game for that player that you can lock in that sleeper league. That matters a lot more than spreading it out over whatever production they get over 4 games. And when you have categories like that come in bunches, where they can come in real, and where you get 3, 4, 5 steals in one game, and then other games where they have 0 or 1 steal, and you can lock in that one where the spike happened, that makes a player a lot more valuable. So the ceiling matters a little bit more in that lock-in format, and it can make players, in categories like steals and blocks, where usually they aren't as impactful because they're just not as common in points formats, so they just don't matter as much in points formats. They can matter more where you can lock in those big games in those categories where the player really goes off. I think that's why I was confused at first why there were so many people in sleeper leagues who loved Dyson Daniels so much, because his averages were good last year in points formats, but the average didn't really tell the full story, because if you were able to get those games where he got like 7 steals in a game and lock that in, he became an elite scorer for you. Even if the other games that week weren't as strong, that doesn't matter. You were able to get that really big game, and you can see why that would matter so much. And the same goes for players who get elite blocks. If you're able to lock in, a huge Walker Kessler, 7 block game, like that, suddenly that changes your week because you have that kind of production from one of your starting slots.
Yeah, it is really interesting how different we would value players in a league like that, where you're just locking in one game. Because I know Josh Lloyd has talked about it at least a handful of times, and I don't know how many other people have, but like just the variation in week to week production or game to game production within a week, where it's like, yes, this is a player's average over the course of a full season, but it's either maybe some games they're averaging or scoring 30, and then the next game they'll score 10, then they'll score 30, versus a player that's maybe just like scoring 20 every game. It's like that difference, and how do you really quantify that? But if you're in a sleeper league where it is a lock-in mode, that is, it just changes how you value players. So that's very interesting. Um, Another player that I think is a good bit better in points leagues that you have here ranked 22 is Domantas Sabonis. And I think he just kind of fits in with that same mold of a lot of points, rebounds, and assists. But is there any worry here about Domantas Sabonis being in like on a Sacramento team that just has a lack of, I guess, clear direction, or could potentially see him get moved in some scenario? Does that affect how you rank him at all?
Yeah, I think I would have him a lot higher if I had more confidence in points formats, especially if I had more confidence in what his future looked like, because Sacramento has been kind of building everything around both the strengths and weaknesses of Domantas Sabonis during his entire time there. And the question is, because that has not led too much other than a single playoff appearance where they came close against Golden State but lost, is that going to be something that other teams are going to be willing to do when his time in Sacramento ends? Or how long is Sacramento going to be willing to continue to take the bad of what Domantas Sabonis' defense looks like to be able to, get the benefit of his offense, which is helpful, and his rebounding is helpful. And he's a guy who's available and plays hard and plays the right way. And there's a lot to like about him, but it's difficult to be able to say that when it's not leading to playoff wins, when you kind of know what the ceiling of it is, how much longer when he's 29 years old coming into the season are teams, including the Kings, being willing to say, yes, we're going to continue to build the entire ship out of Domantas Sabonis? And you kind of saw some cracks at that at the end of last year, at least where the ball was going through him a little bit less late in the season after Zach LaVine comes on. I think with Dennis Schroeder coming in as well, there could be a little bit of a shift to be able to not have the entire offense be so centric on Domantas Sabonis DHOs. And maybe we're going to see those assist numbers down a little bit like they were at the end of this season. Still going to be an elite rebounder, still going to be a super productive in points formats. But I think there is some trepidation here that we're reaching the cliff, and there is going to be a cliff where there aren't going to be teams who are going to be willing to give Sabonis the role that is the most fantasy productive for him. And how long is his prime going to last if that's the case? So he's still a low volume 3-point shooter, even though he's added a little bit of that to his game. He's just a kind of a clunky modern fit in a lot of ways for how teams want to play offense and defense in the NBA in 2025. So I would have some trepidation about that. And I think that there could be good opportunity to be able to sell on him if he's been kind of a core of your points league dynasty team for a while. This might be a good moment before things change rapidly, which they could, because you could easily see the season go off the rails in Sacramento. We know that Vivek is always going to want to be able to win immediately. And if patience finally runs thin on having the team be built around Sabonis, that maybe that change could be coming sooner than we think. The only problem is, are they going to be able to find somebody who's going to be willing to take him on? And I think the answer, at least this offseason, was no. That was something that was talked about before the offseason started, that there were going to be conversations in Sacramento about his future there. I think they probably found that there weren't really any takers. So unless we're going to have another Bulls Kings trade for them to be able to continue to just swap assets back and forth and see if maybe it'll work differently on the other side of the country, I don't really know where Sabonis is headed, but I do think that we might be nearing the end of his fantasy prime.
It is just, every single time it's discussed, just the idea that like the Kings just are Bulls West. It's like, wow, this really got a lot of play and appearances out of Chicago. Let's see how this works in the Western Conference instead of the East. Like that's going to be better. It's just really funny. Funny is a good way to put it. Another player, or I guess a couple players, well, we'll say one player, Ja Morant, is obviously a player that I would say is better in points leagues than in category leagues. And he's ranked 38th in your points dynasty rankings. Is there any, well, I guess just with what Memphis did this offseason, trading away Desmond Bane, they got picks back. They added Cedric Coward. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is there now. Obviously, they'll have Jalen Wells back healthy. It is still a solid team, but I guess maybe you didn't fully replace what Desmond Bane brought. Do you think maybe we could see more out of Ja Morant with, finally a full offseason with a new head coach, not just Taylor Jenkins, maybe more of an emphasis on his pick and rolls with Zach Edey? Maybe we could see one of Ja Morant's better seasons, obviously assuming he stays healthy.
Yeah, my big takeaway from Memphis' season last year is that it just made no sense the way that they used Zach Edey. And when they actually used him as a screener with John Morant at the end of the season, it was extremely effective, which anybody could see. And it's why the front office spent a top 10 pick. And it's why Taylor Jenkins, I think, ultimately got fired, because the front office said, hey, we're going to give you this guy who's going to set bone crushing screens to be able to create a ton of space for our walking paint touch of a point guard. And then they decided to run an offense that did not use ball screens. And you saw immediately how effective that was when Morant and Edey were on the court together. Their offense was 10 points better than when they were not. And then you even saw defensively when Zach Edey and Jaren Jackson Jr. were on the court were on the court together. The Memphis defense was dramatically better on top of it. We had questions coming into the year about whether Edey was going to be effective defensively and stay on the court. And then in the playoffs, I thought he acquitted himself really well against the Thunder, and made them competitive with him on the court in some of those games. Even though the series went the way that it did, there were still competitive portions of it for the Grizzlies against a Thunder team that proved to be NBA champions. So I think Morant is in line for a big season. It's going to depend on some things. Edey's not going to be available at the beginning of the season. We know that Jaren Jackson might not be available at the beginning of the season. So that is going to create some issue. But the big question for me is just availability. And that's the reason that he is as low as he is. He's been much higher. He's been a top 20 guy for me, maybe even higher in my points dynasty rankings before. But when the last, whether it's health or whether it's off-court issues, John Morant has just not been available to be able to play. And that's the number. I talked about how minutes are the lifeblood of fantasy production. Well, games played are a lifeblood as well. If you can't get any fantasy points if you don't play in the games, I think we need to be able to see a shift in that. And we saw some of that last year with Morant, where he talked about, well, I'm not going to dunk anymore because, there's too much risk for my body in doing it. And that's, that might be true, to be honest. I mean, yes, like getting as high as he does at his size and the potential impact on his body of, like crashing down on bodies bigger than him, dunking on them, going up into the lane against guys who are twice his size, that does create real risk for injury. We've seen that play out in his career, but it's also the way that he needs to play to be able to be effective, unless his game is going to change dramatically. So I think that's one of the biggest question marks of this season for me. I would love to see a vintage great John Morant season where he's available more. And I think if that happens, that's why I'm kind of hedging here with this ranking. He's still top 40 for me because of what it can look like if he is available, if he's playing a full minute load, if he's playing in an offense that suits his strengths, where he's coming off of ball screens and getting downhill. That can be elite. And I think there's a chance that we see that version, but there's also a decent chance that we see the version where he's available every other game. You don't know when he's going to be in the lineup, and it becomes extremely frustrating. Now, as a strategic point, if you're playing in a lock-in mode, you're probably okay with the fact that John Morant might not play. He's only going to play 2 out of the 4 games in a given week, because you just need that one game where he looks like John Morant. And I think we're going to have a lot of those this year. So in the kind of format where availability for every single game doesn't matter, I'm higher on Morant. But if you're in a points league where you are able to play every game, there's no cap in your matchup on how many games you can play, and it's just about total points and getting as many games played as possible, then someone like Morant is going to infuriate you with not being available, not being in there, and giving you zeros in games when you need to be able to get production.
All right. Hopefully we'll see Morant stay healthy. Obviously, just scrolling down here, Zion Williamson being 42, obviously ranked 42 in your dynasty points rankings. Obviously kind of a similar situation there. But if we just keep scrolling down, is there anybody that you would consider either ready to have a breakout season specifically for points leagues, or maybe that people are sleeping on, that we could say is like a points league sleeper, no matter how far we go down this ranking? Is there anybody that kind of sticks out to you that kind of fits that mold?
I'm increasingly getting excited about an Assar Thompson breakout season. And I think, I have him, fairly high, but not as high as I think you do or some others do, my points rankings. And I think there was a lot of trepidation for me about the fit, watching a lot of Pistons games, because I am a legacy Pistons fan. I don't really consider myself a fan as much anymore, but I do watch them more than any other team because I grew up a fan of the team. and I like watching Cade Cunningham. And Assar Thompson, as the season went on, you begin to see a synergy and a chemistry between Assar and Jalen Duren, where Duren would get the ball on the short roll. You saw this against the Knicks. If you go back and watch the baskets that Assar Thompson got in that Knicks series, a ton of them are a Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren pick and roll, where Duren gets the ball in the short roll right around the free throw line, and he's able to find Assar Thompson in the dunker spot, roaming around the baseline. And Assar Thompson is just able to get up so quickly that he's able to throw down a dunk and finish at the rim before the Knicks can even get there. And that's something that they kind of slowly developed as the season went on, but it was hyper effective in the playoffs. And that gave me a lot of hope of, even if they do sign Jalen Duren to a contract extension this offseason, while he's extension eligible, that the long-term fit between those guys could work offensively. Defensively, it definitely works because Assar Thompson is going to be needed. And the other reason I think we could be getting a breakout this season from Assar is he's needed for point of attack defense. You're not going to be able to put Cade Cunningham or Jaden Ivey as kind of your point of attack defender on the perimeter. And you saw Assar Thompson against Jalen Brunson in that same series, and you understood why he's so valuable in his defensive role on a team because of the amount of ball pressure that he can put on. And every team needs to have that level of ball pressure in the modern NBA because it is so easy as an offensive player, so easy to be able to get downhill and the defense can do so little to be able to stop players who are in that primary on-ball role, that having someone who is as good as Assar Thompson, who can both slide laterally, but also have the physical strength to be able to deal with what an offensive player can do on a drive with their shoulder, with their forearm, to be able to create space. The fact that he does not back down in those moments and has the strength to be able to hold up, but also the athleticism to be able to stay with them laterally too. It's the same reason why we like Aman Thompson so much. And people have pointed out, like, the per 36 stats of Aman and Assar are not that much different from each other. I think Assar is not the same level of player that Aman is, but he certainly is similar, and that's not surprising. They're twins, but Assar has the ability, if the minutes level up the way that I think they're going to this season, to be able to approach a lot of the same kind of stats that we saw last year from Aman. I don't think necessarily that the rebounding is at the same level as it is with Aman, and that could hold him a little bit back in a points format, but I think a breakout season could be coming for Assar this year.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was per possession or per minute stats, but Amen is basically across the board just like a little bit higher than Assar when you look at things, except for steals. Assar Thompson was actually able to get, or I guess had a better steal rate than what Aman Thompson posted last season. So if we get Assar playing the same amount of minutes as what Amen was able to, especially the second half of last season, yeah, I definitely could see a breakout. I don't think he's quite as, I guess, good offensively, or isn't going to score as much as Amen, which Amen isn't like a elite scorer by any means, but I think that's probably why I don't have points dynasty rankings, but I would say that Assar Thompson would be lower in points leagues than in category leagues because of the amount of defensive stats he's getting versus the, I guess, not lack, but lower production rate in some of the other categories. Anybody else as we continue to scroll down that you would say RJ Barrett is obviously like kind of the face of being better in points leagues, along with a guy like Julius Randle. There's a few others that kind of fit that mold of just being obviously giving you a ton of points, decent amount of rebounds, and not too much else.
Yeah, those are great names. And I do have some trepidation about Barrett's role this season compared to what it was last year. Last year, he got the ball quite a bit and got to operate a little bit as a playmaker, more so than we had seen previously. And I think the problem is with Brandon Ingram incoming, a lot of that opportunity, I think, is going to go to Ingram and take away from Barrett. So if you enjoyed rostering RJ Barrett last year in your dynasty league, this might be a good opportunity to capitalize on the season that he just had, the points averages that are going to show up on the screen when you send that trade over, because I think we're going to see a little bit of a decline this season, depending on health and availability, which is always a question with Ingram. But I think realistically that you're going to see a little bit of a regression to the mean with Barrett. One of the names staying in Detroit that I'm interested in from a points league kind of breakout opportunity is Jaden Ivey, because again, not a great in defensive stats, and that holds him back in categories leagues, but definitely a player that I think is going to have a massive opportunity to play even bigger minutes this season. Really kind of came into his own playing next to Cade Cunningham last year. And then when you saw the rate stats when Cade was off of the floor, they were really fantastic. So I think Ivy could make that leap. It's kind of a post-hype sleeper because, we're at the point now, going into his fourth season where people are probably a little bit less excited for Ivy, and they've moved on to other newer prospects. But I think this could have kind of be the breakout year. I also think Ben Mathurin could have a really big breakout season this year. We just heard Rick Carlisle talk about on a podcast with Caitlin Cooper that he expects Mathurin to start this season. There's going to be a lot of offensive opportunity for Mathurin, and he's a guy who maybe doesn't excite as much in categories leagues because the stat set is limited in some of the 9 categories, but in a points format that in playing in that up-tempo style in Indiana with it, which is very stat friendly, I think that he could have a really big season. It might be kind of, again, a post-hype sleeper in that same draft class as Jaden Ivey that people have forgotten about, but could break out this season with the chance to be able to have an expanded offensive role with Tyrese Halliburton out.
Yeah, definitely excited about what Mathurin's going to be able to do this season, as well as some of the other names you mentioned. But let's shift over to your redraft rankings. Your first look at redraft points league rankings. Pulling that up here, with starting off with Jokic, Giannis, Wemby, Luka, SGA, Cade Cunningham, and Domantas Sabonis here is kind of your top 7. Do you feel? I guess you said this is your first look at trying to do projections for the season. Do you feel like any of these guys, do you feel pretty good with where they are ranked as of right now?
Yeah, I think that what you can see here are the kind of differences for points formats, and this is based on kind of sleeper default format because I find most people that I answer questions for, that I talk with, are playing in that format. But so you might be boosting up some of these guys if their stat set is a little bit more scoring based, but you can really see in the projected points per game and also the fantasy points per minute. So on the right column there, if you're watching on YouTube, I've got listed out their fantasy points per minute, their fantasy points per game based on the projections, and their totals based on what I'm projecting for games played across the season. And what you see right away here is that there's very much a tier, and those top 4 players, Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Victor Wembanyama, Luka Doncic, are kind of all by themselves when it comes to production per game, and even points per minute. And that's because those guys kind of tick all 3 boxes of points, rebounds, and assists, and getting you some other defensive stats, varying degrees of them across them. But because they kind of hit that PRA, big time box score stat production, the triple double potential for those categories, that's really why they separate themselves from everybody else. And an interesting wrinkle of this, I put in the sleeper category. You can see the positions. I put SLP. This is based on sleeper position eligibility for last year. What ends up becoming really difficult is being able to find players who are point guard, shooting guard, or even small forward eligible, who are really good fantasy producers. So there's something to be said for taking those guys. It's a lot easier to find power forwards and centers who are producers. And depending on your format, how many starting slots you have and whether they're broken out based on those individual categories, it can matter to try to get those guards, point guards, shooting guards, and wings early on in your draft, because right away you start to notice a drop off where there's very few who are that productive. And it's hard to be. This is why, like, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was, I think, the top 9 category player last season. He is just not nearly as productive in a format like this. Still very good. I've got him at number 5, but it just doesn't translate the same way because a lot of his value in a 9 category league is like elite free throw percentage, high volume of free throws, great free throw percentage. So he carries you in that category. That just doesn't matter as much here because it's really just getting those single points per free throw. And it's even a half point per free throw made when you're talking about a sleeper default format. So it just doesn't matter the same way. But he's a point guard, shooting guard in sleeper eligibility. So that's really valuable. Cade Cunningham, point guard, shooting guard, and small forward eligibility, which could be super valuable for you to be able to get that. Because otherwise, unless you're just talking about Luka, who has has point guard eligibility in Sleeper. All these other guys that you're seeing here, Jokic, Antetokounmpo, Wembanyama, Sabonis, it's all power forward, center, or only center eligibility. And that's going to be super easy to be able to find as you go on, that you can get guys like Walker Kessler and Ivica Zubac who are elite rebounders and get a bunch of block shots. And so they end up helping you a lot more in this kind of format than they do in a categories format. You can get those guys a little bit later in the mid rounds in your redraft league and still get elite production from the power forward and center slots. So getting those guys early on at those positions can be really important because they dry up really fast.
Yeah, and there's a player that I want to ask about, and it is, well, I'll just say it's Jaylen Brown, who you have ranked 31st. And our partners at FanDuel have the Celtics. It's, you can bet on whether a team is going to make the playoffs or not. Minus 250 odds to make the playoffs, so they're expecting them to make it. And if that's going to happen with, Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis no longer there, with Jason Tatum injured, it's going to rest kind of on Jaylen Brown's shoulders, along with maybe Anthony Simons, Derek White, a couple of the other guys they have there. But a lot of it is going to come down to Jaylen Brown. And I guess how much of a factor is that for you? The fact that, is Jaylen Brown, I don't know where you had Jaylen Brown ranked previously, but do you think he would be, or is he higher this year? As I would say he's better in points leagues than he is in category leagues, because there are a few weaknesses there, like his free throw percentage not being the best. Are you expecting a breakout or maybe one of the better seasons of his career?
I think that the potential is absolutely there because you look at the Boston right now, obviously huge usage vacuum created by Jason Tatum being gone. Who's going to fill it in? Well, I mean, we saw in the playoffs once Tatum was out, it was Jaylen Brown, where they win a game against the Knicks to be able to keep the series alive. He plays great. That's going to be the opportunity that Jaylen Brown's going to have in this season. It's going to get filled in by more Peyton Pritchard. It's going to get filled in by a little bit more of Derek White. And it's going to get filled in, if he's still on the team, by Anthony Simons. But that's the other big question here too. We're getting reports that the Celtics are trying to find a trade partner to be able to move Anthony Simons because they're trying to get below the tax. They want to be able to get completely out of there so they're not in a repeater tax situation going forward. This is an opportunity, a gap year for them to be able to do that. And if they could move on from Simons, who I don't think they intend to be able to sign to an extension, then they could fill in that trade with some other role players to be able to kind of maybe find something that will still work in the 26-27 season when Tatum's back, or if not, then at least salary that is easily movable or is expiring. And I think that, that lack of commitment to Simons long-term, Simons might start. He's going to do what Anthony Simons does if he does get to play. He's going to shoot a ton of threes in Joe Mazzulla's offense. But I don't think there's going to be a desire other than maybe to try to inflate his trade value. But I don't think teams do that as much as we like to think in fantasy circles to give Anthony Simons a big role this season. So it really is going to fall on Brown. It's going to fall on Pritchard. It's going to fall to some extent on Derek White. And those guys are really going to have to carry this offense because you don't have Jason Tatum, you don't have Kristaps Porzingis anymore on this roster to be able to, provide that offensive production, to be able to create their own shots. It's just not going to be there. That's going to put a huge load on Jaylen Brown. So it should be a really strong season for him from a fantasy perspective, especially in points leagues where the efficiency, even if it's a little bit rough in an outsized bigger usage role, isn't there in points formats. In most points formats, at least, that's not going to matter for you.
And as we, start to wrap up this episode, do you have any just general points league specific fantasy strategy tips, maybe for someone that's coming over from playing more category leagues or someone that's coming over from playing fantasy football and still learning how to play fantasy basketball, but still is more familiar with points leagues, or someone's more familiar with category leagues that's learning more about points leagues? I guess any general strategies that you would make sure to consider?
All right, I'll give one for coming over from fantasy football, especially NFL Dynasty, and one for coming over from categories leagues. If you're coming over from NFL Dynasty, you are going to come into this from the perspective of first-round picks being worth their weight in gold. And, Noah, you spoke to that a second ago about that trade where you're like, well, getting 3 first-round picks for my star player is a good deal, because it often is, especially, as a player is kind of like in their prime, near the end of their prime. If you can cash out in your fantasy football Dynasty league league to be able to get 3 first-round picks for a player. You get to be able to just kind of restart your clock, and you get some players who are immediately productive with those picks. And all first-round picks in a standard NFL Dynasty league, if it's a 12-team league, all of them end up being pretty valuable. And there's not huge variation. Yeah, the top of the draft can be a little bit better. Maybe there's an elite prospect up there, but all of those guys end up being like kind of immediately big time dynasty assets. You're getting running backs who are immediately top 30, top 20, even top 15 running backs in the league. Even if you're at the back end of the first round, because that position turns over so fast. Those guys have careers by the time they're 27, 28, they're getting onto their second contract. It's over already. The NBA at 27, 28 years old, you are often not even in your most productive season as a fantasy player. Sometimes that comes at 29 or even 30 years old that players have their best fantasy season. So the length of the career is entirely different, and the time it takes to be able to get productive is entirely different. I have had so many people complain to me in the last couple of years of, why isn't Cade Cunningham better? You have him so high in your rankings. And it wasn't until last year that people finally were like, oh, okay, yeah, now I see what you were talking about, why you had Cade so high, because I didn't get it before, but now I do. And Scoot Henderson's the same thing. People are like, why isn't he immediately productive? Because they're used to getting that star running back who just immediately gets 250 touches in a season and is productive for them, and it doesn't matter that they're young because their prime is immediate. Primes don't happen immediately in this, and for that reason, first round picks are a lot more speculative. And unless you have a top 3 pick, a top 4 pick, depending on the draft class, it's not the sure thing. And even that isn't as much of a sure thing as it is in having it. So I would be super reluctant to trade young players who are in their prime, and prime can start 23, 24, and it can extend into early 30s with guys. If you have guys who are already super productive in that range, don't worry about timelines. Don't be thinking about, this guy's 27 and a lot of my other guys are young, so I need to trade the 27-year-old and trade him in for like 3, like draft picks or like younger players who haven't really done anything yet. Those trades end up in great regret, because you are trading something that's probably going to be productive for 4 or 5 more years at the same level for speculation. And there's no reason to have to do that. Your rebuilds, especially in 10 and 12 team leagues, should be pretty quick. You should be able to turn over a team pretty quickly in that amount of time and be competitive again, especially if you're focused on the right things and getting players who are productive, who have the right trajectory. So don't have that mindset that you just need to blow it up, trade every single thing on your roster, get a bunch of picks, and completely start over, because you're going to be waiting 3 or 4 years to be able to do it. Focus on, you can be young, but you can be productive and young at the same time. That should be your goal with these leagues. Now, if you're coming from a categories league into a points league, the big consideration that you need to make is your format. If you are in a points format with no games caps, no limits on streaming, it will be a stream fest. And your goal should be to have a lot of roster spots to be able to stream in as many players as possible, because you are getting no penalty for playing as many players as possible. This isn't even like a categories league where you're going to hurt your percentages or get too many turnovers and lose those categories because you stream in too many guys. It is all about games played if there's no limit on it. And that means you should be consolidating your roster to the most elite talent possible. And then if you're in a shallower format, if you don't have that many roster spots, if it's only an 8 or 10 team or even 12 team league, you should be churning guys in off of the waiver wire, because there's probably really good productive players, especially short-term players who maybe don't have a lot of long-term value, but have opportunity on their team in that given season, especially late in the season. In the fantasy playoffs, they're going to be guys who have no dynasty value, who are super productive, who are on tanking teams, and you can just churn those guys in to be able to win your matchups if there are no limits. That's why I would suggest in your leagues that you do have limits on how much you are putting, on how many players are able to be streamed in any given week, and to be able to create deeper rosters. So it isn't just a churn of as many players as possible. But if you're in that kind of format where it's not lock-in mode, where there aren't limits on game caps, you need to strategically make room for streaming, and that is how you're going to win. The teams who are going to win are going to have the most games played most weeks. So do those consolidation trades to get the best players, to the most elite players at the top of your roster, and keep spots open through the rest of it to be able to churn in players. If you're in a lock-in mode, like we talked about earlier, then it's really about getting you the most elite roster possible, and making sure that you have players who can have big spike weeks. They might not need to be the most consistent, but you want stat sets where they have those big pop games where you're getting, 40 points in a matchup, 50 points in a matchup, depending on your format, and able to lock that in. That's something that people might not be able to realize by looking at games, at averages of fantasy points, but it depends on the stats that look through the player's game log to be able to see, is this a guy who all of a sudden has huge defensive stats that cause them to spike up? Do they have big scoring outbursts at random points? So they have some bad scoring games and then they have huge outbursts where they're super efficient. Some players are like that. Some guys are not like a steady 20 points a night and they average 20 points. A lot of players have big variation, which can be frustrating. But if you know that it's that kind of player and you're in a lock-in mode, it can be helpful to be able to get those kinds of players on your roster, because you're able to get the full benefit of their big spike weeks.
And I have one just to bring back up my really bad trade that I made 5 years ago, just to kind of put a frame of reference for just how bad it was. I have, I guess, who those picks ended up being that I got for Jokic and DeJounte Murray. And obviously I was sending out good players and getting back picks from that good team. So they were later picks. And I think I ended up trading most of these picks away before I even made them. But the picks ended up being Obi Toppin, Alexei Pokusevsky, Josh Giddey, I think I actually made that pick, and Johnny Davis, and then DeAndre Hunter for Jokic and DeJounte Murray. So just to put a little bit of a frame of reference there for who you could be getting, and that's in a 12-team league. Now, if you're playing in like a 30-team league, then obviously if you're getting some of those late first-round picks, and it ends up being probably an even worse player, and you're less likely to hit. So definitely keep that in mind when you're making those trades. Matt, before I let you go, where can we find these rankings, and what else do you have upcoming that we can be on the lookout for?
All right. Everything that I'm doing, everything that you've heard about today, you can find all of it at patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP. Go ahead and check me out on Twitter at my username at NBA Dynasty ADP to be able to find links to all of that and all of my content. If you're playing in a points format, you get everything that is available for categories formats that you find with other content creators. I've got rankings, trade calculators for points dynasty leagues, consensus dynasty rankings, rookie rankings for points leagues. Everything is tailored to points formats. If you're playing in that, obviously I have category stuff as well. And we're going to be able to continue to put out what you're seeing here, the kind of preview of redraft rankings, which even if you're a dynasty player, I find to be super helpful. You want to be able to know what this year's production is going to be able to look like, especially if you're a win now team. But even if you're not, you want to know, who am I going to be able to trade who's going to have a big year this season, and that I can expect to be able to get more value for once they start producing at the level that's being projected. So that's really helpful to be able to find the players that might be good trade targets, good sells, good buys. I find it to be really helpful exercise, even if you're not playing in a redraft league and you're only playing in Dynasty, to be able to have a sense of what the redraft market looks like, what redraft projections look like.
Yeah, because if you want to win in your Dynasty league, you got to know who's going to be good this year. So I do think that that's definitely has a level of value. Matt, as always, thank you so much for hopping on with me to discuss points leagues. This episode went much better than it would have had it just been me talking about points leagues. That is going to do it for this episode of the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast, which is part of the Old Man Squad Sports Network and the Believe Network, and brought to you by FanDuel. Matt will be back next week, and I will be back tomorrow for another episode.